In 1962, the world narrowly avoided an all-out nuclear war. 1 year later, Hollywood was at war with itself. 2 films, 2 legendary directors, and 1 near-identical storyline about how a system logic error could trigger the apocalypse. So before any bombs could drop on screen, a Hollywood arms race unfolded over who owned the rights to Armageddon. This is the story of the legal battle to end the world.
To protect the future of America, the defense techniques of tomorrow had to be discovered now. That is how SAGE and bursting computers into military service.
That is the whole idea of this machine, you know.
Today, it's hard to imagine Dr. Strangelove as anything other than a comedy. But for the film's creator, it didn't start out that way. In 1961, with principal photography for Lolita completed, Stanley Kubrick was mulling over his next project. At 32 years old, he was already a highly respected director with his greatest works yet to come. But he was becoming obsessed with a problem that he couldn't solve, reading scores of books on the subject and even making plans to move his young family to Australia in order to escape it. Like many others in the early 1960s, Kubrick was terrified of the daily threat of thermonuclear war. 50,000 feet above him, B-52 bombers were circling the globe 24/7, armed with live nuclear weapons and waiting for a single command to drop the bomb. Little Boy, the atomic bomb which levelled Hiroshima, killing around 140,000 people, was 1,600 times less powerful than the B-41 thermonuclear device aboard one of these B-52s. There were around 12 in the sky at any one time, under the watchful gaze of Strategic Air Command.
There is only world peace where there is power to preserve order among nations. And the retaliatory power of the Strategic Air Command of the United States Air Force is the greatest deterrent to general war there is in the world today.
This American military posturing was a direct response to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who spent the late 1950s boasting that Russia was churning out nuclear missiles like sausages. In response, John F. Kennedy's 1960 election campaign was built around the premise of a missile gap, i.e. that the US were lagging behind the Soviets and needed to boost production. As things escalated, the two countries came dangerously close to an actual nuclear exchange during the 1961 crisis in Berlin.
Well, I was interested in whether or not I was going to get blown up by an H-bomb prior to Lolita. My interest intensified itself sort of concurrently with that. I believe that the Berlin crisis took place during Lolita, and about that time I became keenly interested and started reading up on all the, literature.
Kubrick now knew what his next film had to be about. He just needed the right story. So he reached out to Alistair Buchan, head of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in the UK, and asked if he could recommend any novels about nuclear war. Buchan pointed him to a thriller written by a Welsh former RAF navigator, Peter George. Published in the UK as 2 Hours to Doom under a pen name and released in the US as Red Alert. It had all the ingredients that Kubrick was looking for: a rogue commander, a fatal system flaw, and an unstoppable nuclear launch. Kubrick and his production partner James B. Harris quickly secured the rights and set to work on a gritty adaptation. The film's early working titles included Operation Peacemaker, Edge of Doom, and The Delicate Balance of Terror. But as Kubrick got deeper into the research, consuming dozens of books on military strategy, he kept encountering the same problem. To make this serious thriller believable, he found he had to increasingly leave out the actual facts because they seemed silly.
He had bought the book and was trying to make it straight and realized that he couldn't, that it was so utterly insane that it couldn't be done that way. And what he did was say that this is insane. I mean, please, who are we kidding?
The more he examined the logic of mutually assured destruction, the more absurd it seemed. Looking at this through the lens of game theory, safety functioned only if there were a credible promise of shared danger.
I pretty much read the spectrum. The thing that struck me most of all about it was that all these things lead to very paradoxical outcomes. And I suppose this was the most thematically obvious thing about Dr. Strangelove, was the paradoxical outcome of any particular line of thought.
He brought in satirist Terry Southern, scrapped the gritty thriller approach, and rebuilt his vision of the apocalypse as a black comedy. But just as he settled on his new satirical approach to the material, two massive threats emerged to derail the entire project. The first threat was a rival book that exploded onto the bestseller lists in America. It was called Failsafe. Co-authored by political science scholars Eugene Burdick and Harvey Wheeler, it told a remarkably similar story about an accidental nuclear launch, and the film rights were quickly scooped up by an independent producer, Max Youngstein, with Oscar-nominated Sidney Lumet in the director's chair. Kubrick suddenly found that his black comedy was in a race to the finish line against a highly serious rival production. But before he could formulate a plan, a second, infinitely larger threat emerged.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
In October 1962, the world held its breath, as the Cuban Missile Crisis brought two superpowers to the brink of a thermonuclear war. Behind the scenes, Khrushchev and Kennedy were communicating by letter because an official direct hotline didn't yet exist. That link wouldn't be installed until August 1963. For Kubrick, the threat of the rival production was equally immediate. He, Columbia Pictures, and Red Alert author Peter George filed a plagiarism lawsuit against the failsafe production led by Max Youngstein and Sidney Lumet. This was not a standard legal dispute. It was a calculated move by Kubrick, who as a younger man played chess semi-professionally. He used the lawsuit to force a strategic impasse, branding the rival film as a legal liability that was threatening Columbia's investment. The studio was left with one logical choice: protect its significant financial stake in Dr. Strangelove by sidelining the competitor. While the legal battle placed the failsafe production on uncertain ground, both teams forged ahead with their respective films. Neither production had a huge budget, but Strangelove had a bit more money to play with, which was good because they would spend 55% of it on Peter Sellers' $1 million salary.
I am as sorry as you are, Dimitri. Don't say that you're more sorry than I am, because I'm capable of being just as sorry as you are.
Shoot it off! Shoot with a gun! That's what the bullets are for, you twit!
The whole point of the Doomsday Machine is lost. If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
Meanwhile, Failsafe boasted a superb ensemble cast, led by Henry Fonda as the president. Larry Hagman, who would go on to play JR in Dallas, served as the president's Russian translator, and the role of General Black was portrayed by Dan O'Herlihy, who would later appear in one of my favourite movies of 1987.
Nice shooting, son. What's your name? Murphy.
Walter Matthau, perhaps now remembered more as a comedy actor, played the deadly serious role of Professor Grutterscheller, who was the equivalent of Sellers' Strangelove.
I say every war, including thermonuclear war, must have a winner and a loser. Which would you rather be?
In a nuclear war, everyone loses.
Herman Kahn was a real-life inspiration for the Strangelove character and his equivalent Grutterscheller in Failsafe. Kahn was an eminent systems theorist and author of the controversial book on thermonuclear war, and someone that Kubrick and his wife Christiane knew personally, having been introduced by Paul Newman. Kahn essentially rejected the idea of mutually assured destruction, arguing that America could absorb a nuclear strike and with a bit of careful planning could emerge victorious, being a big advocate for fallout shelters. He even went as far as devising a national triage system for contaminated radioactive food, with the elderly placed near the bottom of the pile and the absolute most toxic nuclear reactive food being reserved for farm animals. Strangelove mentions the Bland Corporation, very much a parody of the real-life Rand Corporation, a think tank where Kahn worked for 14 years before co-founding the Hudson Institute. The Doomsday Machine in Dr. Strangelove was also Kahn's idea, and he even approached Kubrick later to claim royalties, which was a non-starter as far as Kubrick was concerned, who was famously very careful with money. The Doomsday Machine and its automated defence bring us to the core premise of both films, as they each ask exactly the same question. What happens when the machines designed to protect us end up being the biggest threat to our very survival? In Failsafe, the apocalypse is triggered by pure mechanical error. A blown condenser incorrectly transmits a go code to a squadron of bombers. Because the fault lies with the machine, both the original novel and Lumet's film explore the humanity of its characters more deeply. Failsafe is very sympathetic to the people involved. It focuses on good, rational men doing their jobs to the absolute best of their abilities, only to realise that the system that they serve is ultimately flawed. You see this clearly in Dan O'Herlihy's character, General Black. He is a brave, honest, military family man. He is a realist, but he is absolutely not a hawk.
We're going too fast.
Can you be more specific, General?
We're setting up a war machine that acts faster than the ability of men to control it.
Dr. Strangelove takes the exact opposite approach. The system works as designed. The failure is human.
I want all privately owned radios to be immediately impounded.
Yes, sir.
They might be used to issue instructions to saboteurs.
A rogue general exploits a legitimate protocol to bypass the chain of command.
I was under the impression that I was the only one in authority to order the use of nuclear weapons.
Instead of a sympathetic character study, Kubrick populates his war room with clear, caricatured villains. The direct counterpart in Dr. Strangelove to Failsafe's General Black is General Buck Turgidson. Turgidson is a gum-chewing, aggressive hawk who views the accidental launch not as a tragedy but as a strategic opportunity.
We are rapidly approaching a moment of truth, both for ourselves as human beings and for the life of our nation. Now, truth is not always a pleasant thing.
And while Turgidson is a comic exaggeration, his underlying worldview was firmly rooted in reality. The character was heavily based on the real-life Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, General Curtis LeMay. LeMay was a hardliner who consistently pushed President Kennedy towards aggressive military action. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, LeMay advocated heavily for American ground troops to storm the beaches of Cuba. What LeMay didn't know was that the Soviet Union had secretly deployed roughly 100 tactical nuclear weapons to the island. These included battlefield rockets and cruise missiles specifically intended to annihilate any American amphibious landing force. An invasion would have triggered an immediate localised nuclear exchange. The terrifying reality is that human error and system malfunctions nearly ended the world on several occasions. In 1961, a B-52 bomber broke apart over Goldsboro, North Carolina, dropping 2 live nuclear payloads onto American soil. By pure luck, only a single safety switch prevented a nuclear disaster. During the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine, B-59, lost contact with Moscow while being pursued by the US Navy. Believing incorrectly that war had already broken out, the captain ordered the launch of a nuclear torpedo. Protocol required the unanimous consent of 3 officers. One man, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to agree. He held the line and single-handedly prevented a nuclear war. While Arkhipov held the line at sea, the wider Cuban Missile Crisis ended through a direct agreement. Khrushchev ordered the removal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba. In exchange, Kennedy pledged not to invade the island and secretly agreed to dismantle the American missile sites in Turkey. The world survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, but Hollywood still had to resolve its own standoff. Columbia Pictures ended the legal stalemate with a simple financial transaction. They bought the failsafe production outright. This gave them total control over both projects. Kubrick applied his chess-playing background to secure a first-mover advantage. Dr. Strangelove would hit the theatres first, with Failsafe limping onto the screens a whole 9 months later. An advance press screening for Dr. Strangelove was officially scheduled for the 22nd of November 1963.
Something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
That exact day, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Kubrick immediately cancelled the event out of respect for the national tragedy. The studio delayed the official release to January the 29th, 1964. When Dr. Strangelove finally opened, audiences laughed at the absurdity of mutually assured destruction. Although there was some criticism by the press perceiving it as anti-American, it was a commercial success and eventually lauded as a masterpiece. Failsafe was released in October that same year. Because the public had been conditioned to view the subject as a dark comedy, they rejected a straight-faced version of this very similar story. Failsafe did not do well at the box office and became largely forgotten. Director Sidney Lumet understood exactly how this scheduling decision destroyed his film's impact.
I know that being released second was totally detrimental, critically and then commercially. It's hard to compare Strangelove and Failsafe because the intentions were so different.
This is the President of the United States. Do you hear me clearly?
Hello, Dimitri. Listen, I can't hear too well. Do you suppose you could turn the music down just a little?
Stanley wanted to do it with very, very broad comedy, and he more than brought it off. It's a brilliant movie. I wish in the release of the pictures that we had been released first, because it would be very hard to take this movie seriously right after you've seen Strangelove. Conversely, I've made Strangelove perhaps work even better than it did if you'd seen this first, because you'd have the source of what was to be laughed at.
I personally agree with Lumet. Failsafe is a very fine film with some extraordinary performances, and it has this palpable sense of dread that builds throughout the film and has an ending that is both unpredictable and very hard to watch. It deserves to be remembered. In 1967, Robert F. Kennedy wrote an article which would be published posthumously as 13 Days, a memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In it, he highlighted the critical need to understand the other side's perspective. In both Dr. Strangelove and Failsafe, the attempt to understand the enemy begins only when the world is already ending. Both films serve as a permanent record of a time when the world stood on the absolute brink, and have lessons that our leaders today would do well to remember. Thanks for watching.